Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this event, which is the third in a three-part event series we are running, looking at the future of cities, which is very kindly supported by Legal and General. As I've said at the start of each event, I think we can be fairly confident that COVID hasn't killed our cities, but I also think that COVID will change our cities in a variety of ways. In what specific ways, I think, is yet to be determined. And I think some cities will be affected more than others. So those are points of discussion, which I'm sure will come up in today's event. And to make the big topic of future of cities manageable, in each of the sessions, we are taking one aspect of that agenda and looking at it in a bit more detail, fully appreciating that it relates to the other aspects. So last week, if you were with us, we looked at the future of urban living. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at the future of urban work, or the future of work in our cities. And today, we're exploring that third aspect, the sort of play aspect, if you want to call it that, the future of urban entertainment. So will the pandemic change the way people use cities for leisure, for socializing, and for shopping? And if the answer is yes, then in what ways? If the answer is no, it's going to be a very short event. So before I introduce my panelists, as always, a few words of housekeeping. The event is being recorded and you can get a copy of it on our website after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. If you want to tweet about the event, you can do so. The hashtag is Future of Cities. There is always opportunities to put your questions to our panelists after they've made their opening remarks. You can do that at any time. You don't have to wait until all three have spoken. And you do that via the chat function. You'll see in the chat function, there's a channel called Ask a Question posted in there, and we will get to them when we get to the questions element. And we'll be finished by 12 o'clock. So let me introduce our panelists. And the first thing to say is that there's a late change to the panel. Unfortunately, Sasha Lord is unwell and so can't be with us today, but we have a more than excellent replacement in the shape of my colleague, Valentine Quinio. Valentine is the analyst at Centre for Cities, and she leads on all of our work in relation to city centres, town centres, and high streets. So a perfect replacement. My second brilliant panelist is Trish Willetts. Trish is the director of Coventry's Business Improvement District, its BID, and has been deeply involved in Coventry's City of Culture programme, bringing the business community together with the culture programme that is underway in Coventry. And my third panelist is Denizer Ibrahim, who's the head of retail and futuring at Legal and General, and has the small task of thinking about how the trends affecting the retail industry will play out and what that means for Legal and General as a big investor, a big landlord, and a big developer over time as well. So a big challenge, but we're going to hear lots from him shortly. So that's our panel. As usual, each of them will take 5, but no more than 10 minutes to set out their stall on this question, this issue, and then we'll get into questions. Valentine is going to go first, and to help us kind of get an overview of the picture, is going to share a couple of slides. Then we'll go to Trish, and then we'll go to Dens. So without further ado, Valentine, over to you.
Thank you. Right, so setting the scene before you, sort of just a quick introduction to the topic and setting the scene for today's discussion. So this is from a report which we published a few years ago now called What's in Store, which looks at the role cities play not just as places of production, but also as places of consumption. So we know that cities offer scale and density, which makes them attractive places to do business, and that's why cities concentrate the majority of jobs in the country. But the same reasons also support a greater number of amenities. So density essentially creates a larger market of customers, and that explains why cities are home to the majority of amenities, and especially specialist amenities like cinemas, restaurants, and theatres. So this is what you can see on the slide here. So cities account for 58% of all food and drink amenities nearly 70% of all entertainment venues and more than 80% of performing art venues. And especially many of them were located in the city centre, and that's for the same reason as to why cities attract amenities. City centres only account for 2% of population, but nearly 20% of all these specialist amenities. And that's because they're able to attract customers from outside the city centre and outside the city, funneling demand for these amenities to exist. And that's why high streets exist, and that's why they're located where they are. So moving on to what we've learned in the past 18 months now using footfall data. So we launched the High Street Tracker back in June 2020, and we've updated it on a monthly basis since then. So the tracker uses footfall and spend data to track recovery across the UK's 63 largest city centres. And so that's just an overview of where we are at the moment. So we last updated the tracker last week with data up until early November. And what it shows is that city centres are on a clear track to recovery. So we've seen footfall creeping up since the economy reopened back in June. And we've seen levels of footfall going up since then on a sort of consistent basis. However, footfall is not yet back to where it was pre-COVID in a number of cities. So overall, we are about 75% of the way there. But just about 11 cities have fully bounced back to where they were pre-COVID. And so the majority of them are still yet to fully bounce back. And what the footfall data allows us to do is to look at the breakdown of this overall footfall for different days of the week and different times of the day. And so that allows us to understand what's happening, not just in terms of general footfall, but also what's happening specifically during the weekend, in the evening and during the week. And what we've seen so far is that cities are recovering quicker as places for leisure and consumption than as places for work. So weekend and nighttime footfall are recovering much quicker than weekday activity. And this is what is shown on the chart here, which looks at the snapshot from the first week of November. You see that weekend activity is nearly back to where it was pre-COVID. Nighttime is about 90% there, but it's only 70% for weekday. So what that means essentially is that people are more keen to go back to the high street on the weekend and to go to the pub in the evening than to go to the office. But that also tells us that cities are reclaiming their role as places for consumption. And that's important because we've heard a lot about the shift online or the shift to local centres, but actually what that tells us is that cities and city centres in particular still play a key role in, as a prime destination for shopping and for leisure. And what this footfall data also allows us to do is to try and understand where people come from. And so this is what we've looked at during the weekend and during the week. And what that tells us is that cities are sort of regaining their catchment area during the weekend much more than they are during the week. So that's important because non-city residents account for a wide share of customer demand in the weekend. So it's about 47% of weekend visitors pre-COVID. And these people are coming back to the city centre much more than long distance commuters. So this is what is shown on the chart here, looking at once again where we were in the first week of November this year. You see, if you just focus at non-city residents, so people who live outside the city, about 60% of them are back on weekdays. So this is weekday daytime activity, against 94% on the weekend. So that means that people are keen to come back for shopping and for leisure, even if they live outside the city, way more than they are to come back to the office. Focusing on what we've seen in terms of weekend activities. So in a number of places, actually, weekend footfall is higher than what it was pre-COVID. So here I've just displayed the top and bottom 10 recovery footfall in terms of the weekend activity. So you see in places like Blackpool, for instance, we're about 160% to where we were pre-COVID. That's 140 in Southend and nearly similar, 135 in Cardiff. That said, it's not the case everywhere. You see, interestingly, Coventry is in the bottom 10, but it's nearly there in terms of weekend recovery. But looking at London, for instance, it's still not bounced back. So with a focus on what's happening in London. So this is looking at what's happening in London. So this is looking at the similar breakdown for nighttime, weekday and weekend activity. And you can see with a sort of time series perspective here how this played out over time. So essentially since COVID hit back in early 2020, well, weekend activity was consistently higher than weekday activity. However, what that tells us is that, well, we see that nighttime and weekend is consistently above weekday. And that seems to be driven by people coming from outside. So you see a similar statistic to what I showed earlier in terms of where people come from. And you see that most of the recovery in terms of the weekend is driven by people coming from outside the city. So 65% of outside residents are back on the weekend, and that's again 38% during the week. So essentially long distance commuters are not back, but long distance shoppers are back. However, what that tells us is that even for all of these scores, nighttime, weekend and weekday, none of them are back to where they were pre-COVID. And you see there's a clear still gap to full recovery. So interestingly, what that tells us is that if you look at nighttime, for instance, the fact that nighttime is above weekday means that people coming to the city centre in the evening are not just office workers who stay in town in the evening, but it's also people who come specifically for nighttime activity and to benefit from or to enjoy London's nightlife. However, the fact that it's still not back to where it was pre-COVID raises questions as to what needs to happen for the nighttime activity and also for weekend activity to bounce back. And the focus on the nighttime activity actually tells us that for it to bounce back, it will need more of these workers to come back. And so these two here are related, and that's the case in a number of cities. And what you can see on this final chart here, and that confirms what I've just explained, is that there's a clear link between the nighttime recovery and the weekday recovery. And so what that tells us is that for a number of places which are still below their pre-pandemic levels in terms of nighttime footfall, well, for many of them, in order for the nighttime activity to bounce back, it will need more workers to come back. And that's because workers, well, office workers in particular, account for a wide proportion of overall demand for restaurants, pubs, and cafes. And so that explains the gap to recovery. And so what that tells us, and I'm not going to go into the details in terms of what happens if workers don't come back, but what that tells us is that they are essential for the nighttime activity to fully bounce back to its pre-lockdown levels. I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Valentine. Give us a kind of overview of the latest figures. For the purposes of today, I think we can say, we need to think about our cities rightly. We often talk about them as centres of production and activity and work, and that's really important, but actually they are also centres for entertainment, joy and fun. I appreciate for some those two things may be the same thing, but they are centres for entertainment, joy and fun. And the good news is in some respects that as centres for joy, fun and entertainment, more of our cities have recovered than they have necessarily as places to work, particularly on a weekday basis. So I think that's a kind of big heading that we can get into when we get to the conversation after we've heard from our next two panelists. So Trish, over to you. Give us a sense as to what's going on in Coventry, but also I think how you bring these two aspects together through the City of Culture work that I know you've been heavily involved in. Trish.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. For us to see ourselves in the bottom 10 was a bit of a shock. There is evidence that our footfall counters are not working correctly, which I'm very happy to share with you all today, and hence me getting involved with this very interesting conversation. What we've been doing as a business improvement district is really driving the cultural aspects on everything that we do, which is absolutely the way forward we see, especially as the fact that we are delighted to be the UK City of Culture for this current year. Our friends at the City of Culture Trust have been doing a phenomenal amount of work, maverick work, as they've been putting on events for and with us in the city centre. But what we've done as a business improvement district is have a couple of incredible projects that we're delivering on behalf of the City of Culture. One of those projects is called In Paint We Trust, which is a set of street murals that are going up around the city to help with the destination. We've been bringing in some significant artists through the funding that our friends at the Trust have given, and ourselves at the Business Improvement District that we've invested into the project, and it's really drawing people to the city. The next project that we're working on is the Show Windows project. The Show Windows is where we're bringing artists' work into our business windows, and we're working with many national brands as well as local independent brands. So we currently have the government art collection in City Arcade, which is one of our oldest parts of the city centre. That art collection was chosen by our friends at one of our local charities, the Carriers of Hope, and it's really bringing people in to look at incredible pieces of work in a part of the city centre that isn't necessarily the most inviting. The national brands that we're working with are New Look, Primark, the World Trading Team, the Botanist, and we're absolutely delighted to say one of our building societies, the Nationwide, has helped us link with our great friends in Liverpool and Hull, because they've got windows in their unit on Broadgate, and we've gone back to our previous City of Culture friends, Liverpool and Hull, with windows there. This month, we've actually taken Coventry windows out to Mumbai. So we've gone international this month too. Again, all of our windows are being mapped and are available to see for everyone on the Smartify app. Smartify app for art is the largest global downloaded app for art in the world, and the Show Windows is the first project that's gone on to that. What we've been doing again is making our city ready for the destination, because of us being UK City of Culture. So leisure-wise, we've our friends at the council have repurposed with the Historic Coventry Trust to Drapers Hall. The St Mary's Guildhall is having a massive investment at the moment. We just opened the 4-star hotel, the Telegraph Hotel, which has gone, which is a bespoke hotel and has gone into an old print business, the old newspaper business. What we're doing is repurposing a lot of the buildings to be cultural and help with the destination, so that leisure time and the dwell time is huge. We just opened the Christmas campaign with our friends at Destination Coventry. So we are working as a collective. So it's not just ourselves at the bid, but it's much more a collective approach to the city. And we've all put our money in the pot together, and we've got a huge campaign that we're on ITV, we're on the BBC, we're on Sky, we're advertising Coventry right through all the projects that we have. We've got an ice rink in the cathedral ruins for this Christmas, a Christmas market, and then ourselves, as you can see behind us, we've just made another major investment to the Christmas lights in Coventry, and have spent £90,000 on lights. You can see all the maps that my team have been working on to bring the offer. It's absolutely having a significant effect on our dwell time. Our late night shopping is Wednesdays. Our Christmas light switch on was the 17th of November, and we had just shy of 8,000 people coming to the city centre, and many of them saying that they hadn't been in the city centre for 2 years. As Valentine was quite rightly saying, our nighttime economy is feeling absolutely loved right now, and our weekend is really doing exceptionally well. As you saw off the figures, it's 96%. So the true count in Coventry is not out there yet, but we are working tirelessly to resolve that. But I am delighted with where we are, because our businesses are recovering exceptionally well. It's wonderful problems that we're having, that many of our businesses aren't able to take bookings for food and drink because they're full. But what we've been doing in the Business Improvement District is encouraging more leisure businesses in. On the 10th of December, we open our next leisure business, and you'll all be delighted to know it's the Boom Bar. So we'll be having axe throwing and dart throwing opening in the city centre, which then complements the wall, which is the climbing wall team. It complements all of our food and drink offers and add another layer. We've been delighted this year to have our new music venue open in the city centre, which is the HMV Empire. They've been bringing phenomenal guests in. So the Empire was opened by Ed Sheeran. Yes, Ed has been in Coventry. We've also had Paul Weller and some other brilliant, significant artists. So again, for our nighttime offer, you can see what we're doing as a team is we're bringing that offer in. So the nighttime stats are absolutely right. Our footfall counters need to be sorted, but hopefully we'll get the contract in and sorted very, very quickly. But it is very much about that leisure offer as we come out of the pandemic. You know, we've all been very, very concerned about how the city might recover, but the fact that many of our cultural activities are carrying on regardless. You know, all of the projects through the City of Culture Trust are being delivered, and it's absolutely shining a light on our city. So yeah, we're very, very happy. The City of Culture projects are brought in over 142,000 tickets. So again, that's having a significant impact. So that, alongside our correct footfall figures, will have a proof of the year. We have been extremely lucky to have won the title of UK City of Culture on the 7th of December 2017, because who by George would have thought over the last couple of years we would have had the annihilation of the pandemic, but that our recovery will be on a sharp trajectory, and we're very, very happy about that. We've had some major players and we've still got an awful lot to do, because our City of Culture year now goes right the way through to May next year. And one of the finale weekends is the BBC Radio One Big Weekender, where we'll be bringing international artists into the city centre. And again, we'll have a significant impact on our businesses. So we are smiling in Coventry and we're delighted to be. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Trish. A combination of axe throwing and alcohol. I don't know whether I should be excited or fearful about that, but I'm sure we'll see what happens. But I think that, I mean, in addition to the long list of the things that you're doing, the framing of what you're doing as part of a kind of redevelopment, redesign, rethink of what the town centre is and the role it should play in the broader kind of city, I think is part and parcel of the
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, putting our head, Andrew, above the parapet and saying to be the UK City of Culture was a very significant moment. Sometimes you have to say we're not good enough.
Exactly. So I think we can definitely come back to that and get some more reflections for you from you on the let's hear from our third panelist, Den's from Legal and General. As I say, a great title of Head of Retail and Futuring, but thinking really about what's going on in the consumer world and the implications that has for institutions such as Legal and General and all its partners and tenants. Den's, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for inviting me to this very interesting session. I mean, where do I start? I think it's worth giving some context and where we're coming from, right? So, I mean, I joined Legal and General in October 2019, 6 months before the world changed. And about 3 months before I joined, I remember presenting to the board of Legal and General Real Assets Investment Management and telling them, like, explaining to them over the last, I guess, 8 years of my thinking about the way retail is changing. And a few things really resonated in that conversation, which weirdly 12 months later came to fruition and was accelerated through the pandemic. You know, we spoke about this wasn't a market shift in retail, right? This wasn't about a market which was going to come back and which was going to be in the same guise that it was 10, 20 years ago, because it was a cultural shift. It was a cultural shift in how customers engage with brands and retailers and how they spent their money and how customers engaged and frequented space and place in their town centres. And I remember presenting this one pager, which said, these are the key ingredients of the future town centre or the future retail centre of tomorrow. And they were localism, they were curation by the landlord, they were driving experience, they were digital is going to eat up conventional functional shopping, they were landlords working closer with occupiers, and they were the commercial leasing framework will completely be flipped on its head. 12 months later, we have a world which all of those things were completely accelerated. You know, we had a world where all of a sudden localism was the word of the day. You know, it was about how do we begin to engage our local customers, our local citizens of our towns, whether they're primary urban city centres or they're secondary tertiary towns. And our ownership spans from all the way from Eastbourne in the south coast up to Dundee, and we own £4 billion worth of retail stuff, from shopping centres to retail parks to retail warehousing. And we were doing some incredible things pre-March 2020, and we put that in our strategy, and it all began to launch during the pandemic. And they were a variety of things, from launching a brand new high street in the middle of Poole, completely dedicated for independents and locals, launching markets and events programs for local communities and local people to engage within their shopping centres, introducing healthcare and education concepts within our shopping centres to completely diversify the activation, diversify the experience of these customers, integrating online, introducing a flexible partnership model, which is all about turnover leases and getting closer with our occupiers to ensure that our assets weren't a barrier to their business, but more a springboard to their business. So we began to launch this all in the pandemic. And it was really interesting because I look back 8 years ago when I started talking about this, when I graduated from LSE Cities, and all of this was coming into fruition, but it was coming really quickly. And in some ways, it was a kick up the bum for retail to really begin to think about how do we engage our customers, how do we drive the most value for our investors, and how do we begin to really get closer to our occupiers. So that's the now, that's the immediate piece, right? And we can talk about that later on in the session. But there's a macro piece to this. There's a massive shift in what's happening culturally within society in how we engage with our town centres and our shopping centres. If you think about the three aspects of life, work, live and play, each one of those have had a seismic shift, not only in the last 18 months, but have been gradually having a seismic shift in I guess what I call my generation, you know, that kind of graduated 8 to 10 years ago, because our work life has become increasingly nomadic. It's no longer a 9 to 5. It's completely digital. So I can work, email, do anything, anywhere, anytime, whether I'm in a sunbed in Mykonos or I'm in a shopping centre in Dundee. It makes no difference, right? I can do my work anywhere, anytime. And it's increasingly being focused around well-being and around health and around work-life balance. And I'm sitting in my living room right now working, and in this afternoon I'll be in a face-to-face workshop in the middle of London, you know, and I work for a very big corporate where historically 10 years ago that would have been unimaginable. So you've got work life, which has seismically changed. Then you've got live life. You know, we're living in smaller environments, smaller properties, you know, ownership, I don't know the stats, but ownership is reducing. You know, there's a massive increase in people just renting, having subscription living space. You know, that has had a slight shift during the pandemic with people wanting to move out of town, but actually that hasn't changed a huge amount in terms of how people are living and using their live spaces. And I'll come on to why. And there's a lot more borrowing in terms of the next generation, what I call bank of mum and dad. I think there was a stat which I've got written somewhere here, where by 2033, single person occupiers will make up 41% of UK households. So there's less people living with more people, if that makes sense. So people are living on their own more in smaller environments, supported by their parents. So when you think about the shifts that are happening in work life, the shifts that are happening in live life, you know, I think what's going to happen to the world of retail and the world of our town centres is they're going to become the true third space. They're going to become the place where I entertain my guests, you know, because I haven't got a kitchen big enough, where I take my partner out for dinner because I live in a shared apartment, you know, or because I want to begin to work somewhere. You know, that play space, that true third place, becomes a completely hybrid place, beyond just buying a product, beyond just buying stuff, and we're going to see that more and more. We're creating shopping centers where you go in and you can buy something, but you can attend a yoga class, you can drop your kid off to a nursery, you can go and learn a skill in a college, you can go and get yourself checked out in a health clinic. You can go and sit on a desk and rent it for the day and be co-working. You can go and have a coffee, you can go and experience local makers who are there in front of their citizens, trying to talk about their wares and what they're doing. And I think what's happened in the last 18 months is that it's completely accelerated that cultural shift that was bubbling along for the last generation, for the last 10, 15 years. And I think we're in a really, really interesting place. And I hope this innovation that we're seeing through landlords and through our peers, begins to continue. And this kind of is a springboard for how we really reimagine and reframe our town centres and our retail places.
Fantastic, very good, excellent. Great, three great contributions. Axe throwing and alcohol from Trish, and Dundee and Mykonos from Dens. It's kind of combinations of things going on there. I suppose let me start with a kind of biggish question. Start with you, Dens. Get Valentine to come in, and then Trish, you can come in and give us the kind of Coventry view of it, I suppose. You paint this picture, Dens, which I'm very attracted to. I can see that. How do you think that plays out then across different types of cities? So, we heard from Valentine that, smaller, mid-sized places maybe have recovered a bit stronger and a bit quicker. Big cities seem to be lagging for a bunch of reasons that she talked about. But, from your view, how do you differentiate then between, big and small, or is it rich and poor, or is it hub and spoke? Just give us your view on that perspective, and I get Valentine to say something about from the numbers.
Yeah, listen, I think it's a really interesting question. I think the majority of our assets are in secondary and tertiary towns, and we've had a real advantage off the back of that, because we've been able to have a very, very concentrated catchment that we thought, right, we've got to understand our customer really well. We have to engage with them. We have to curate content which is right for them. And we talk about this notion of the landlord of tomorrow shift from librarian, which was collecting rent, renting shops and cleaning spaces, to editor, to making sure they understand their audiences, to curate content which engages the right audiences at the right times. So we're in a relatively luxurious place because we've got towns where we completely understand our customer and our demographic. And what we're trying to do is increase dwell time, increase experience time, increase spend, widen catchment. And we have a very focused mission around that. And it moves beyond buying product. Now, if you begin to think about where cities have gone, and core cities, and I'm a born and brought up Londoner, what's happened is that especially in the past 18 months, our cities have become a series of mini villages. There's been and it changes depending on where you are in the city, but if you begin to think about East London, and I was walking through East London, probably, I think it was I've lost track of time now. I think it was the second lockdown, can't remember, but one of the lockdowns, and there was obviously restrictions of who was open when, you had to sit outside, I can't remember what it was. But what ended up happening is you had a series of streets that would become their own vicinity. And then you walk through a bit of a ghost town, and you have another series of streets which will become their own vicinity. And what was really interesting is that it became a pocket of villages. And each one had their own little culture, their own little vibe, their own little energy. And then that moved along. And I felt that was really, really interesting, because as ever, a city has an identity, and it has some sort of ingrained fabric or DNA, and what ended up happening, that began to fragment. And I felt that was really, really interesting, of how these independent businesses, these local businesses, really began to build relationships with certain customers during certain times. And it was actually quite refreshing to see, I can't talk for other cities where I wasn't there during lockdown, but during my London time in lockdown, that was a fascinating thing to see. And I think that will continue. I think there will be. And
do you see the relevance of what you've described for London, particularly East London, which has gone through 15, 20 years of regeneration, which, it's a much different place today than it was 15, 20 years ago. But beyond that, do you see the relevance in what you're talking about for other places, maybe smaller places or less prosperous places, the kind of things that you talked about? Or it's not criticism, but are you primarily talking about some of our bigger places, our more prosperous places, being able to kind of manage and respond to these sorts of things. And say it's not a criticism, it's just kind of trying to figure out how this plays out across different types of places. I
think crudely, it's the death of cookie cutter and it's the death of homogenous streets. What it is it's the revival of localism. It's the revival of big brands adapting to become much more localized. I'm not just talking about little boutique fishmongers and butchers. I'm talking about bigger brands adapting to respond to the locale that they sit in. And this is what's exciting. We don't want to walk through clone towns and clone cities anymore, and the pandemic has driven that. And seeing brands, big brands, national brands adapt to the societal shifts that were happening during lockdown in order to respond to the way their customers wanted to engage with their brand was what was refreshing. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
That's a good point. Valentine, I'll come to you in a second. Trish, just pick up on that. And as I said, when you kind of finished, what you were describing in terms of the activities that are currently going on sit in a broader program of redevelopment and redesign and rethinking, which is about what Coventry is as a place, but actually and particularly what the city centre and the role of the city centre should be relative to what it currently or has been in the past. But just give me a kind of lessons or reflections on that and the importance of those two things going on together.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as Denizer really greatly said, we were looking at the change of the city way back in 2016, 2017, when we applied to be the UK City of Culture. What that title has allowed us as a city to do is to come together and pool resources, but also apply for so many more pots of money. We at Coventry being one of the only bids in the country that has applied for national ACE funding. We're a business team, we're a customer service team, but we've applied for cultural money as part of the show windows project, and I'm delighted to say we won that money. And we got £150,000 that have added into the fact that we can now bring a 12-month program of show windows, not just a couple of windows at a moment in time. So it's really changed the way that we work as a team. When we went into the pandemic, we were a team of 3. As we've come out of the pandemic and we are culturally aware, we're now a team of 7. So I've been able to take on more people, but think very differently, rather than just the customer service role where we've done cleaning and greening and the normal bid work. We culturally engage with our businesses and making that shift change. So yeah, as you say, this was something that's been coming for a while. We've been able to jump on the bandwagon really quickly. And as cities have opened up, be able to go, bang, here's an event, here's an event, here's an event. Oh, and by the way, tomorrow there's another event and another event, because the plan of action with the teams in the city right now, and as a delivery partner for the City of Culture, we've all been able to do that really quickly. So as we look to ourselves in the new year, at the end of May, when the City of Culture title is passed on to our next friends, and a good luck to anyone who's on the call today that have applied to be the next City of Culture in 2025. It's a moment in time that we can have had that shift change very quickly. I'm not saying it's been easy, it's been bonkers busy, but we've been able to make that shift change really quickly because the title of UK City of Culture has brought in many more new leisure businesses, the fact that the footfall is changing and that we're adding to the agenda. So yeah, it's a great time. It's a great time for us. We're very
excellent. Very good. Thank you very much. Valentine, I mean, just pick up on this point. Just say, you said it in your print, just say a little bit about where we are in terms of big, small, because I think, or, rich, poor, the way that we can try to disaggregate the different types of challenges that different types of cities will face, given all the changes that Dens was kind of outlining, because they're affecting everywhere, albeit differently, but then they play out at the place level quite differently as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pattern we've seen so far, like you said, and that's not just been true in the past few months, but actually since COVID hit, is that smaller city centres have been, larger city centres have been hit hardest, and smaller city centres have bounced back quicker. So that's true for the sort of overall footfall perspective, but it's also true when you look at the breakdown for weekend and nighttime activity. But interestingly, that also has to do with the role that these city centres played pre-COVID. So we know that large and strong city centres pre-COVID relied much more on weekday footfall, and that hasn't recovered yet. Whereas in smaller places, footfall, well, relied much more on weekend train. And so that explains the differences we see in terms of overall recovery. But interestingly, for large cities, you know, essentially we know that they've struggled to bounce back because they haven't recovered their catchment area. So that's for, you know, weekday footfall, that's workers, and that has an impact on the nighttime economy. And on weekend footfall, it's also visitors and tourists. And so that explains why cities like London are you know, struggling to bounce back. And so, you know, the questions that arise now in terms of the recovery is that, you know, we know that smaller and perhaps weaker city centres are bouncing back, but they're also bouncing back to relatively weaker positions. And for large and strong city centres, you know, they will need workers to come back to fully bounce back. But if they do, they will recover and return to a fairly strong position.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. I want to pick up on a couple of, we've had a few questions on this about, you know, the nature of the offer and how it needs to evolve and change. Trish, start with you. You said just in your last contribution, you said something like, you know, the mix of uses that you see now in the city centre is changing over time, you know, because of the changing nature of the demand. So just outline that a little bit more, you know, in the sense of how is the literally floor space being reallocated from one use to the next. And I'll come to Dens and see what kind of thoughts he's got on that, because I know you've written about meanwhile uses and pop-up uses as well, Dens, as kind of a mechanism to get to somewhere else from where you are. But Trish, just how is literally the city centre changing?
Sorry, I was unmuted. I do apologise.
Oh, sorry.
I couldn't unmute myself. It was
okay. No problem.
So yeah, I mean, if we look at our great friends in West Orchard, which is one of our shopping centres in the middle of Coventry, we had a Debenhams store that took over 3 floors of the unit. It was almost a catastrophe for that unit to go. But what happened during lockdown was the centre itself was sold to a conglomerate of private owners. It was at a reduced price, absolutely. It was down to 4.85 million from a 36 million pound previous sale, so a significant reduction. But the team that then bought it absolutely are completely on point with the fact that they're bringing a massive investment behind them. So Debenhams, 3 floors have all been completely relet. So one of the floors is going to leisure. So we've got a 10-lane Brunswick bowling alley going in alongside a cocktail bar and alongside a crazy golf. An office organisation coming in, taking one of the other floors, and another clothing brand coming in, taking one of the others. So it was a frightening moment for the city. We saw such a large business fold, but the reality is we've had 3 floors of awesomeness that we've been able to change that offer, but it's very much leisure. We had a similar situation with the IKEA building in the city centre. The IKEA building, our friends at IKEA, we were the only city centre IKEA building, and they closed that just as we were going into lockdown. The great news for that is we've got another 7 floors of awesomeness, and the council have taken a fantastic step forward and have taken over the unit and are now in many conversations with government art collections to come in and be part of the offer for that building. So there's a studio going in one of the floors that will be producing films and art in Coventry, which is a lovely moment in time. Big change. So retail being a much more cultural offer because of our title.
Fantastic, brilliant. Dens, just pick up that kind of question about, you know, how town centres in terms of floor space and uses, how would you characterise it? Where does it need to go? Where can we look for good examples?
Okay, so where were we 10 years ago? 10 years ago, we were in a place where basically the job was fill gaps, fill boxes, right? So there was not really an overarching strategy. There wasn't really a thought process about, okay, what does the customer experience look like? What does the occupier alignment look like? What do they actually want, right? How do we begin to stitch together these experiences for shopping centres, for retail parks? How do we begin to think about that? So what we're trying to do is begin to create a really strategic thought process of how we embed that and create a framework around that. So everything that we do, before jumping to what we call the reposition piece, which is legacy stuff, big stuff, you know, plugging in a hospital at the end of a shopping centre, or a college or a school or a cinema, whatever it is, before you get to that stage, how do you begin to embed it? How do you begin to think about, okay, what does this actually look like from a customer human level, from an experiential piece, but also a commercial level so it all stitches together? So we go through a whole process of reframing. So reframing the function of the asset and reframing the experience of the customer. So that's basically what I call guerrilla retail. Small, impactful stuff that is relatively cheap to do, but big impact. So launching markets. We've got a whole events program going in which hosts 1,000 events a year, completely reinventing our public realm of our shopping centres and retail parks. So we create a completely civic and democratic space, which joins the centre and the spaces together. Then you've got remodel, which is all about how do you reimagine and diversify the occupier base beyond just retail and shopping. So if you had 100% retail space, you now go down to 50, 60%, and the other uses, healthcare, education, workspace, leisure, you know, SME local pieces, markets, whatever it could be, all the other bits of animation that flow and drive engagement for the existing occupiers that we really believe are partnered with us. And then you've got the diversifying of the revenue piece. And obviously we represent a lot of investors, and our whole mission is about how do we drive the most value for these three customers: investors, occupiers, and consumers, people that walk through the door. So the diversifying the revenue piece aligns with the occupier piece. You know, how do we drive a sustainable amount of income, a sustainable investment profile for our occupiers and our investors? So everything that we do is basically boiling down to a couple of things. You know, diversifying the occupier base so it responds to what the customer wants, making sure that we create a really, really strong, glued together, stitched together asset, which is able to kind of ensure that the experience of that customer and that is relevant and evolves and agile for the future. You know, we can't just have a space that we think, okay, this is great for 20 years time. You know, this is going to constantly evolve. So everything that we're doing is about curating that mix to ensure it's relevant to what the customer wants and what the occupier wants.
Very good. Excellent. Okay. So I want to change tack slightly. Again, got a few questions in this sort of space. I want to explore kind of your thoughts on kind of the role of, you know, consumption, role of entertainment, role of creatives in the sort of city redevelopment process. You know, as Jane Jacobs, I like to quote Jane Jacobs if I possibly can, as often as I, you know, can. She said many things, but one of the things she said, you know, was when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. And there's something about, you know, there's something more to it than just simply that quote, obviously. But there is a big literature about creative cultural activities being the catalysts, the underpinners to what makes cities exciting and attractive. I wonder what your kind of thoughts on that. Do we underplay that, or do we overplay that? I think it can be overstated in some respects, but I think it can be understated in others. And are you worried that, you know, we don't give enough recognition to that when we then think about how we maintain a diversity of spaces? So a lot in there, but it's just an interesting kind of set of forces. Dens, you go first on that. It's a big question, but just unpack it a little bit.
So macro is, you've got I think a retail real estate business, which is, or historically has been pretty inflexible, pretty inflexible, pretty static, right? And then you've got a consumer market that is meant to be engaging, which is extremely agile, extremely demanding, wanting more from that environment. So what we're having to try to do is begin to create agile, flexible places which respond to that environment. Forget the layer of digital, which completely adds a whole other piece in this. But essentially, if you begin to create environments which are dynamic, which are ever evolving, which are changing, you know, no town centre, no shopping centre, no retail park is the same on a Wednesday at 11 o'clock in the morning to a Friday night at 8 o'clock. So you have to be able to respond to that. You know, so there's an element of fixed pieces within these environments, and there's an element of fluid pieces. So for example, the events that we curate, you know, change from old people yoga at 9, 10 in the morning, you know, to kids clubs at 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon to then, I don't know, an art class or an after school club to, I don't know, how to DJ in the evening. So it completely responds to the customers and how they change and how they engage with that place. So you have to create fluid stuff which engages with the fixed stuff. But then you've got another layer of digital, and the world of digital and how that has created a layer of kind of experience is really, really interesting, right? Because essentially what we say is currently digital kind of ticks off the kind of convenience and functional shopping piece, right? So if I want to buy deodorant, a black t-shirt, or some socks, I'll go online and I'll buy it. I won't go into a shopping center in the next 5-10 years to do that, really, the majority, you know. And then there's a whole element of subscription where they'll come through. And then you've got the experiential piece. But the overarching overlaying piece of that is that everything that we're going to do in the future is about shareability. So how do we create moments and memories, whatever it looks like, wherever it is, where people feel like they have the ability to share, review, talk about, or discuss in an online forum within a physical environment.
And
so
just I suppose in a very narrow sense, I mean, in the assets that you're either owning or thinking about owning or, you know, developing and investing in, are you increasingly thinking, we're not necessarily going to take the highest rent on every individual parcel, but we're thinking about the mix. And part of that mix is about the vibrancy and the dynamic and the variation. And therefore, crudely, a lower rent from parcel X or from parcel Y actually drives value across the total building or the total asset. Do you see that as an increasing area for institutions like yourself?
Completely. It all has to fit together and stitch together. I can give you a live example. So the brand new high street that we launched in Poole, which is called Kingland, was basically a street that tailed off of our shopping centre called Dolphin Shopping Centre. It was a pretty sad, vacant looking street. We decided that it was a real untapped creative community in that town. So we decided to allocate 10 shops, which we kind of black box, white boxed, and gave for free to 10 incredible creatives, at which we highly kind of curated that environment. Fishmongers, coffee roasters, surf shops, cool groceries, but all of that was for free. But what that has done in the past 6 months, we're doing every 6 months a review of that. What that has done is it's driven footfall, it's driven dwell time, it's driven spend. We've worked out that it's driven around £1.6 million worth of spend within the centre and the town centre because we've done that. But it's also given us a really interesting story for us to tell wider occupiers who want to be part of that. So what does success look like for that? Success is, we're going to bring new occupiers in that want to be in there for the long term, who want to pay, but also we begin to have digital first businesses that come in that we can talk to our customers beyond the doors of our shopping centre. So we're creating a much bigger conversation with them. Excellent.
Okay, Trish, give us, your view. I mean, I suppose, the more successful Coventry becomes, prices, will invariably go up because demand is going up. If you're not careful, that kind of drives out a variation and diversity, that you've been very much talking about. Do you have a deliberate plan to maintain that diversity of activity and uses? Is that part of the kind of development program?
Yeah, absolutely. With so much of the physical is now, with the public realm work and what have you to prepare us for the City Culture year. And our plan of action as we go through the legacy planning is well advanced now. So as we finish as the UK City Culture year in May, all the big events really go from that moment on. So we're renowned. One of our fantastic events that takes place in the city centre is Motorfest. Motorfest team are planned and are bringing that event straight away that first weekend in June. So City Culture, we celebrate that moment end of May, first week in June. The next week in June is our great friends at Coventry Pride, the next big event. And then ourselves, the third week in June is the Food Festival. So the Food Festival in 2019, because obviously we weren't able to bring it last year, brought 142,000 people to the city. Our plan of action, and no apologies, but I'm going to say it, we're going bigger than Ludlow in 2022 because we want that to be a really lovely offer. And we're taking the Food Festival right across the city centre to all parts and working really closely with our friends at Coventry University. So our planning is very much about that continuation and that dwell and the events. Our Food Festival went in 2019, a great example, just going back on Denizer work, was that a family came in and sat on a sofa in our event space because the Prosecco bar was there. So Granny was there, Mom was there, the granddaughter was there, the family was there. They sat on the sofa for the day. They enjoyed the food festival show. Granny had 12 Proseccos, God love her. But then the family then went off as the day was going on and they went shopping. So by the time they'd finished the day, they had bags around them on the sofa at the food festival and they'd spent £400. So it is very much about the activation that will then have the secondary dwell, that will then have the secondary and third spend. So that's what we.
Of course, anybody listening, we encourage you to drink responsibly at all times, know your limits and all of that. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. And I suppose my last question is almost sort of turn it on its head. We talked a little bit about, what the trends are, what consumers are looking for, what investors and developers are kind of responding to, businesses are doing. Going to turn it on its head for the last sort of question, start with you, Valentine, is, what should, given what we know, what the trends, what we've observed, what is it that we think policymakers now should be doing or thinking about? How do they respond to what we've been discussing? What would be our advice and guidance, not just to individual places, but I suppose, more broadly, the policymaker community at the national or local level? But Valentine, your thoughts on that, and then I'll get Trish and Dens to finish us off.
Well, I think that relates to your previous question, which is, the fact that we know that culture and leisure and the experience economy is extremely important for cities, and we can hardly imagine cities without them. And what we've seen in the past few months is that cities are reclaiming their role as a prime destination for that, precisely because there's no or very little sort of online alternative. But the point in terms of policy is that a thriving high street with loads of museum, restaurants, cafes and pubs is a symptom of success rather than its cause. And so what that means in terms of policy is that we can't just prescribe more culture on the high street without addressing the fundamental challenge which go with it, which is having just more money in the local economy, and that will go with investing in skills, for instance. So it's not the restaurant that attracts high skill jobs, but it's the opposite.
Yeah, that's a very neat summary, really, of the integration and interconnectedness between the three aspects that we've explored over the events, which is the work, the live, and the play. In a sense, you have to think about these things, as we know, pretty much together, but nevertheless, you have to kind of also make progress on them. Trish, your thought on, what would your advice to places outside of Coventry be, based on your experience? What should policymakers, city leaders, and national leaders be thinking about, or in this sort of space, making the most of the urban entertainment offer?
Yeah, absolutely. Reuse, reshape and repurpose. We just opened at the Drapers Hall with the Historic Coventry Trust team. That place had been mothballed for 30 years. It's now a music venue. It's going to be a space where the Coventry music organisations are able to go and teach young people how to play musical instruments, and then have an events programme right on the top. So don't think of things as they were, but think of things in a new way and repurposed.
Brilliant, very good. And Dens, last thoughts from you on this. What advice are you giving to policymakers up and down the country?
Yeah, I don't think it's just solely the responsibility of policymakers, right? I think it's anyone that's involved in this, whether you're a landlord or a policymaker or part of the local authority or kind of the key decision makers. I guess one of the biggest missions for us was, how do we get closer to our local authorities to make them very clear about our strategies and where we want to take this, not only in the next year, but the next 5, 10, 15 years. So I think there's a real opportunity here for landlords to bring skill sets in-house, to be able to build relationships with and talk the same language as these policymakers, these local authorities, to be able to not only and the key players in each town, right? We've got to think about the universities, the education, the healthcare, the businesses, local stakeholder businesses, and think about how together we can drive a much more relevant and dynamic and agile town centre for the citizens of that town.
Brilliant, very good. Thank you very much indeed. It's 1 minute past 12. Unfortunately, we need to finish. We could carry on. Lots more to discuss. As I said at the beginning, you'll find the recordings of this event and the other two in the 3-part series on our website, centreforcities.org. Please go and have a look if you haven't seen them already. Now, my thanks to our panel today, Valentine, Trish and Dens. Thank you very much for being with us and sharing some great thoughts. Huge thanks to Legal and General for working with us on the event series. Hugely thankful for them for their support and their kind of contributions to all three. Thank you all again for joining and for your questions. Until the next time, stay safe and take care. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you.